poems based on paintings by the great American painter Edward Hopper, who's painting from about 1900 until he paints his last painting in 1965. You can tell he lived for a very long time and lived through a very interesting period in American history, which influenced all of us subsequently, I think, even here in little remote Ireland. Anyway, the series of poems I call This Silent Landscape, and the first poem I'm going to read is called Dawn in Pennsylvania, based on a painting of Hopper's from 1942. Now this painting is of a railway station or track, really. We're standing quite back on the platform, and it was kind of a frame that the platform provides on a dark cityscape in the background. So quite industrial city in America. We see a bit of the back end of the train in the picture, and we have a trolley to our right. Anyway, I'm interested really in this poem in capturing the men actually who built this station and who built America, the railway tracks and the buildings, forgotten from history and absent in this painting. So I'm interested in what Hopper's left out in a way. Not that he wants to capture that, but that's the way I see it in a way. Anyway, Dawn in Pennsylvania. They are nowhere to be seen, the men who built these tracks, that trolley, the train, the distant blocks of brick. From iron, coke, chromium steel, these things were made, with sweat and shouts, hoists, pulleys, chains, the fighting of Yid and Mick and Chink. It seems unreal, funereal, empty. As dawn breaks open this day, I hear invisible voices. The wheel of history turns, implacable, like industry, splitting them up, spitting them out.
Hi, I'd like to welcome you here to The Right Stuff this evening, and we have Carlow poet Derek Coyle with us. Derek is a professor of English literature up in St Patrick's College here in Carlow and hails all the way from Kill in County Kildare. So Derek, expand on that. Tell us a bit more about yourself.
Well, gosh, yeah, well, I'm from Kill, just up the road, in Lily White, down here spying on the Carlow people just to see what they're up to down this neck of the woods. I'm in Carlow 10 years. As I say, I lecture in English literature and Irish studies in Carlow College, and before that I was in Glasgow, University of Glasgow. I did a PhD there looking at poetry and theology, and I was a Maynooth before that for a number of years.
Excellent stuff.
Many years studying.
So you're a distinguished poet here in Carlow. You're well known through the literary circles.
Yes.
And you're moving further afield. Tell us a little bit about what inspires you to write poetry.
Okay, well, gosh, well, I've had a big interest in poetry for many years, nearly 20 years at this stage. Poetry inspires poetry, so I would read a lot of it, which I really enjoy, from the best of contemporary Irish poetry, or Seamus Heaney, Michael Longley, whatever, to the best of what's happening internationally, so like American poets like Louise Gluck and Mark Strand. And then I like, say, classic poetry, Caffafi, great 19th century, early 20th century Greek poet, who would have been a big influence on my work. So at that level, poetry inspires poetry is an important idea. And then things that happen in your life, you know, the old broken heart scenario might happen, has happened, you might write about that.
I think we've all been there at some stage in our writing.
Yeah.
Tell us, when you come across a particular subject, I know you're working on a series of poems at the moment about the artist Hopper. Mm-hmm. What is it that draws you to a subject and makes you want to explore it and create poems from it?
Yeah, okay. Well, I have been interested in art the last while. I started first by looking at the Baroque Italian painter Caravaggio. Now, partly what's drawn me there was, we all know about Caravaggio in Ireland. If you remember the early 90s, there was a discovery of a Caravaggio in Dublin, The Taking of Christ, and now the most expensive picture in Ireland and one of the most classic and so on. So initially I was interested in that picture. I knew bits about Caravaggio's lifestyle. I knew he was a bit of a renegade, and I read more about him, and he was a very intriguing man, eternal man. You probably want him as your friend, but very interesting. He killed a guy in a duel. He was very arrogant. He would throw food in a waiter's face in a restaurant if he didn't like it. So he was very interesting, and the paintings, of course, were very brilliant. So that really got me into the art thing.
So when you're writing your poems about Caravaggio and his painting, do you try and take Caravaggio's character and instill them in your poem, or is it more the imagery from the poem?
A combination of the two. I would have written some poems kind of growing out his life, trying to capture his voice. I mean, three things about Caravaggio is he said very little. Where we hear Caravaggio's voice, actually, believe it or not, is in the court records. He was in court quite a bit for various reasons. And that's where we hear him speak. So we actually hear very little from Caravaggio. He painted himself actually into a number of paintings. In The Taking of Christ, for example, he's the guy holding up the lamp. And so on. So we know what he looks like, and there's a remarkable consistency actually as to how his face matures and ages in the paintings over the years. So sometimes it's the paintings which just purely inspire you, sometimes something about his life or whatever. Then just to get onto the Hopper, I've been to New York several times, and that's where I first kind of saw Hopper. He lived in New York. He was very strongly connected with the Whitney Museum in New York, and I went there in 2009, and I saw a number of the very famous paintings, Early Sunday Morning and so on. So it started from there. I wrote poems about many paintings I saw on that trip to New York, and the Hopper just seemed to stand out. I wrote 6 or 7 of them, and a friend had actually suggested to me that would I consider sort of a day in the life with Edward Hopper kind of thing, and I said, gee, yeah, why not? And I just went with that then, and the paintings are brilliant. They're a brilliant portrait of a certain strand of 20th century America. I think that world has affected us in many ways, and we understand it and know it. So I felt that was a subject that would be of interest to people, and was of interest to me. So that's kind of how I went into Edward Hopper. So, by the way, let me say, Edward Hopper is far less interesting than Caravaggio. He's actually quite a boring man who did very little, but he painted a lot. Great painting. The second poem I'm going to read is from a painting that I saw in the Whitney Museum in New York in 2009. The Whitney is a big museum of modern art in New York, a museum that Hopper and his wife Jo had a lifelong relationship with. This is one of his very famous paintings, Early Sunday Morning. It's a street scene in New York, those typical brownstone type buildings you see in New York. It's a city street, very humble. Barber shop, we can see the barber's pole, a couple of other shops. On the ground floor, we see a long shadow from a fire hydrant, so we know it's early in the morning, the sun is just rising. And we see blinds drawn down on a number of the windows on the second floor, where presumably the owners of the shops live and stuff like that. The painting was painted in 1929, if I recall correctly, actually, or maybe 1930. And I'm thinking of America and the Great Depression and the strikes and stuff that were starting to kick off at that point in American history. That's kind of a bit of the backdrop to my poem and the picture. Anyway, Early Sunday Morning. Any dork can see this street is a decent place for business. Butchers, barbers, grocers, open shop fronts to black and white, yellow and red, gawking, walking, talking. And be it shop talk, news talk, small talk, just let it be rumours of the best mutton, not sit-down strikes and pickets. Silence is a blue sky, red brick, blinds drawn down. No time is a good time to look at how things stand.
So you have your subject in Hopper, and you'll do your research, I assume, and go through his paintings and his life and all of that. What's the routine then for you to sit down and create the poem?
Okay, you're dead right. I would read. I write generally on the weekend because I'm working during the week. You might be tired in the evenings and stuff like that. So I work on the weekend. I would typically be out and in a local coffee shop by 11 o'clock on a Saturday morning, and I would read for a couple of hours generally. Could read a biography of Hopper. I would read quite a bit about history in the period. I might read up on some of the paintings and stuff like that. And then I'd feel I was warming myself up and limbering myself up, and if I was in the mood and I felt things were going well, and sometimes it's not about the mood, sometimes you just have to do it. I'd sit down and write in the afternoon. Now I could write from 1 poem to 3 poems typically. I'd select a painting and I'd just get started, and I'd go through 3 or 4 drafts to get my first take on the poem, as it were.
Do you have a particular ritual that you have to follow before you put ink on paper or finger to keyboard, as the case may be.
Yeah, that's common enough for people. I like white blank paper. Generally, often rejects from the printing machine, so to speak. There's often something on the other side, and I'd use, being a little bit conscientious about saving the environment. I'd write on the other half. I have certain pens that I like, that I buy in the office centre here in Carlow. I generally like a black or blue, and flowing ink, if you know what I mean, as opposed to a ballpoint. Would that be it? And I write them by hand. All my early drafts you'd write by hand. That'd be the biggest kind of ritual I'd have, I'd say, of just a certain kind of paper and pen.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think we all do a lot of things to avoid writing, and so we have our little rituals to get us into it. Talk to me about structure and form of your poems. Do you have a set structure, or do you play with it, or what's the technique behind your poems?
Poetry or whatever. Yeah, I've discovered form latterly, or in this book with Hopper, that became more apparent. I'm sure an audience familiar with poetry would know of a thing called free verse. That's kind of became very popular in the early 20th century. T.S. Eliot, the American poet, would have been a big practitioner, where you had no set verse form. Verse libre, sometimes known as well. Free verse, that's the French title. That's popular with contemporary writers still, and I would have used that a good bit, certainly in the past. What I've discovered latterly, as I was redrafting some of these Hopper poems, was I found what form gives you. Now, I'd always heard poets over the years, James Heaney, others, whatever, always talk about form being a liberation. People have this thing, you're trapped into a set pattern, and that restricts you. It's not true. You really, after a while, when you've been writing and practicing poetry, you begin to realise, I could compare it to, when a builder's building a house, and he might map out the foundation with stakes and that little orange rope and so on. Form kind of gives you that. It gives you something in which to work.
Is there a roadmap?
It does, a roadmap to start to build. And in poetry we talk about voice, and what you find is that if you're moving, say, to couplets, which is 2-line verses, right, that I describe it as corners, that it shapes the voice. It gives you certain stresses and structures in the form that allows you to build tension in and emphasis, and what I call stress. And that's what form gives you. And really it's a big leg up in terms of actually building a voice.
So you don't find form or structure restrictive in any way?
No. Ultimately, you will begin to find that you start to write poems an awful lot easier with form. Once you kind of make an early decision that you're kind of going to go a certain way. I have to say, I nearly find once you're, at the moment anyway, and I touch wood, that this will continue. Almost the poem nearly seems to write itself, actually, in a strange way. So, anyway, couplets, quatrains, that 4-verse form, would be two very big popular forms for contemporary poets who write in form, and I would use both of them, and sometimes triplets, 3-line verses, and they're a huge asset in writing poetry.
So another way to describe poetry would be an economy of words, or words used for maximum impact. How does that affect your poems? Like, if you're writing a poem, do you agonise over the words you use, or do they generally come very easily to you?
Most of the time they can kind of come quite easy, but there is an agonising in a sense of, in poetry we say every word counts, every word has to earn its place, and you just take out anything that doesn't fit in or is excessive, having said that already, you just not need it there. So there's a tautness, a tightness in poetry, where it's everything is there, for every full stop, every space, every comma is considered on the page for its effect. Should it be there or should it not? And you often take something out and put it in, and that is a type of agonising. Words can come easy enough. I have to say, I have fallen in love with the Rhyme and Dictionary this year, and people think, that's somehow cheating or whatever. It's not. I've seen pictures of poets with their thesauruses and their Rhyme and Dictionaries there beside them. It just brings lots of new possibilities to mind. So one of my habits, you asked me about going about writing, is when I'm setting about getting into the mood and the mode, what I will have often is I have a draft of my poem, and I go and just pick out 4 or 5 keywords in my draft, and I go to my Rhyme and Dictionary, and I write out lists of words that interest me for their sound or what they might suggest. And the amazing thing is, they're words but you're not immediately bringing them to mind. And the amazing thing is, you can get a whole new great line from and a whole new way to start a poem from just these new words. So you can go, oh Jesus, yeah, there we go, and you come up with a new idea you wouldn't have thought of otherwise, just from the word. This is a poem based on Hopper's most famous painting. It's from 1942. It's called Nighthawks. It's late in a city, probably a city very much like New York. A couple, or certainly a man and a woman, have wandered into a diner called Phillies. We know that because it's written over the top of the shop, as it were, in the painting, or the diner. There's a man to our left, kind of perusing a menu, and there's a serviceman behind the counter who, in my reading of the painting, has just turned from the man reading the menu to look and address the couple who have wandered in. Of course, the challenge in a great famous painting like this is to try and come up with a new angle on it. I feel I've done that, but I'm not going to say anything about that here. I leave that to the listener or the reader to discern what it is. I name the woman in the picture, I call her Kelly, and the serviceman I call Joe Daly, and the man reading the menu I call him John. Just so people know that, as it were. Any Tom Waits fans might recall Tom Waits' great album from the early 70s, Nighthawks at the Diner. That title, and maybe even the concept, I suspect probably comes from Hopper. So we're seeing Hopper's influence on American culture right across the board, from Tom Waits to Alfred Hitchcock. Anyway, Nighthawks. Any sort of queer hawk could wander into Phillies. Its light congenial in the stark night of the city. Tonight it is Kelly, staring at what she is about to eat, who considers carefully the last words of the man beside her. Will he or will he not? As Joe Daly, cordial, in-house genie, whose business it is to look sincere, turns away from John, part-time serviceman, mulling over a menu, pretending. They'll laugh about it later, in the dark, after the glow of cigarette light dies, listening together, satisfied.
Is being a poet a thankless task?
It depends, Porrick, then, from what point of view you want to pursue that question. Shelley, the great romantic English poet, said in his famous essay, Defence of Poetry, that poets were the unacknowledged legislators of the world, which makes them sound very serious and grand. You probably wouldn't make that sort of claim today, I think, so seriously. So in terms of a wider, huge audience, I mean, poetry doesn't have that sort of audience. It's not like rock stars or, film stars, or even minor celebrities for appearing on, the Song for Ireland or something like that. So it never command that sort of audience. But if you were to come down to just say personal reward, Yeats, the great Irish poet, William Butler Yeats, said famously once, I'm never happier than when I'm writing poetry. And I can relate to that. You can just get totally caught up in a very joyous moment. Something didn't exist before you started, and you're satisfied that something does exist when you're finished. And it's a bit like playing football when you're a kid. 4 or 5 hours later, after you went out with your mates, your mother's calling you in saying it's time for bed on a Sunday evening in the summer. Where's that time gone? You kind of come out of it saying, oh geez, you were so caught up into it, and it was so enjoyable. So for yourself, it can be very, very gratifying. If you're hoping to make a mint and retire early to the Caribbean to sit in the yacht and smoke cigars and drink brandy, you're probably not going to make it out with poetry,
I think a lot of writing is like that.
Yeah.
Derek, I'd like to thank you for coming on The Right Stuff this evening, and I'm sure we'll talk to you